Welcome. My name is Alan Gerber. I'm the director of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies, and today's event is an ISPS democracy event. ISPS has been holding a series of events this year, bringing together experts from Yale and beyond to shed light on key questions concerning American politics, governance, and democracy. This is the last event in the ISPS democracy series this academic year, and will continue with new events this coming fall. Before we begin today's event, I'd like to thank the organizers who put everything together, and without whose help we wouldn't be able to hold these events. That would be Pam Green, Pam LaMonica, Tori Bilski, and Lamore Peer. A little bit about today's logistics. After introductions of the panelists, each panelist will talk for about 10 minutes, followed by discussion and a question and answer period moderated by Stephen Wilkinson. Please save your questions till the end. During the question and answer period, you will be able to use the raise hand button on the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can also send questions to the panelists via chat. Please keep your questions brief. This event is being recorded, and if you need technical assistance, please email isps@yale.edu. So now I'd like to introduce all of tonight's panelists at once. They will talk one after another without interruption. Here are tonight's panelists, or this afternoon's panelists. First, Elisa Celis. Elisa is Assistant Professor of Statistics and Data Science at Yale. She is a co-founder of the Computation and Society Initiative at Yale. She's an expert on artificial intelligence and ethics, and her research focuses on how algorithms encode and perpetuate social and economic biases. Her work has included designing voting techniques that allow for the election of diverse committees, including the implementation's Fair Elections in Switzerland project, which is what I believe she'll be talking about or focusing her remarks on this afternoon. Our second speaker is Mark Gorton. Mark is the founder and chairman of Tower Research Capital, LLC, one of the leading computerized trading firms in the world. Gorton advocates for livable streets, alternative transportation, and open government as the founder and chairman of Open Plans, a nonprofit devoted to the pursuit of smart planning and civic engagement through media and digital tools. He is the chairman of Reinvent Albany, a nonprofit focused on transparency, accountability, and good government in New York State. He is a graduate of Yale University with a BS in electrical engineering and an MS in electrical engineering from Stanford, as well as an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Our third panelist is Helen Landmore. Landemore is Associate Professor of Political Science at Yale. Her new book, Open Democracy, Reinventing Popular Rule for the 21st Century, came out this fall at Princeton University Press. The book discusses democratic representation and how we could open up our electoral institutions to ordinary citizens, including via what she terms open mini publics. Landemore's previous book, Democratic Reason, was awarded the 2015 David and Elaine Spitz Prize for Best Book in Liberal and/or Democratic Theory, and the Ideas, Knowledge, and Politics Best Book Award by the American Political Science Association. Helen is a policy expert engaged in several initiatives to promote democracy, working with governments and think tanks around the world. And our fourth speaker is Rob Richie. Richie is president and CEO of FairVote. Rob founded FairVote in 1992. FairVote is a nonprofit organization that researches and advocates election reforms to increase voter turnout, accountable governance, and fair representation. He has been involved in introducing ranked choice voting in states and more than 20 cities. He is a graduate of Haverford College, where he serves on its corporation. Our moderator is Stephen Wilkinson. Stephen is the Nilaki Professor of India and South Asian Studies and a professor of political science and international affairs. He is the currently the Henry R. Luce Director of the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. Wilkinson is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and his research focuses on South Asia. His most recent book, Army and Nation, examined India's success in managing the colonial army it inherited in 1947. He has previously published Votes and Violence, Electoral Competition and Ethnic Riots in India, which examines the roots of communal violence in South Asia. That book was the winner of the Woodrow Wilson Prize of the American Political Science Association for Best Book on Government, Politics, and International Affairs. So with that, let me turn it over to our panelists and our moderator. Our first speaker is Professor Celis.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Alan. It's really great to be here as part of this series and with all these amazing panelists. I'm really excited about the conversation that we'll be having today. So what I wanted to talk about today is representation in multi-winner voting, and in particular, a case study of some work I was really lucky to be a part of, which happened in Switzerland in 2017, 2018. So what was going on there is, in Switzerland, there's different cantons. So you can think of a canton kind of like a state. And the canton of Vaud had decided by vote to rewrite its constitution. So it's completely starting from scratch. And of course, the next question, once you decide to rewrite the constitution, is who is actually going to be doing that rewriting? And there was a lot of concern and a lot of debate in the public sphere as to how one could ensure that in this rewriting process, the interests of every citizen in the canton of Vaud would be adequately represented when rewriting these rules. So while there, I was working at FairVote at the time in the neighboring canton. I was lucky to get connected with a group of activists and also various political parties who were very interested in the concept of finding representative ways to conduct these elections that still adhere to some of the usual principles that we have when conducting an election in terms of maximizing the number of votes that we would have. So in a traditional, what I would call a traditional multi-winner voting election, if you want to say elect 4 candidates, maybe you have 8 candidates that are running and you want to elect 4 of them. Normally one person comes in, they can cast their votes, the next person comes in, they cast their votes, and so on and so forth, until everyone has cast their votes. In multi-winner elections, often you get to vote for more than one person, so it might be a little bit different than some elections, than other elections that you might be familiar with. But everyone casts, one by one, everyone casts their votes. At the end of the day, you just add them up, see how many votes each particular candidate had. And once you do that, you sort those votes from highest to lowest. And traditionally, the top candidates, up to however many you need for your committee, win. So if you're electing 4 candidates, here are your 4 winners of this mock cartoon election. So the problem, sorry, I don't know what's going on with my slides today. So the problem with this is that this can result in very disproportionate groups of candidates that are elected with respect to criteria that you might care of with respect to representation, such as gender or age or race or locality. So the question was, how can we have an election that still satisfies some representation type of constraints? So for example, one could have a criteria that says we would want equal or roughly equal numbers of men and women to win. So if you have one criteria, such as this, and you can partition your candidates, it's pretty easy to know what you should do. You just take, say, you can of course satisfy these constraints trivially by taking any 2 women and any 2 men in this toy example. But that's of course not what you want to do. What you want to do is take the 2 women that have the most votes and the 2 men that have the most votes, and that seems reasonable, right? You're satisfying this criteria, but you're also adhering to this prioritization of the votes, right? You're still speaking to what the people are voting for, right? So the goal overall in these types of questions is select the committee with the most votes that still satisfies the kind of diversity constraints that you would care about. The problem is that if you have more than one criteria, this becomes computationally hard. And that's the perspective that I approach it from. My background is in computer science. I'm in the statistics and data science department here at Yale. And that's basically when I was able to step in and play a role. The question is, how can we balance multiple criteria, because we care about representation across many different dimensions. And along with some colleagues, I was able to work on this problem and come up with some really interesting technical solutions in the vein of approximation algorithms that help you come up with, help you design this in a way that once you collect all of these votes, you can do exactly what you wanted, right? You satisfy all these criteria, and conditioned on satisfying all the diversity and representation criteria that you care about, you return a committee, you produce a committee that has the most number of votes. So it was really exciting to be a part of this and actually be able to have this type of solution implemented and used in this particular election. Of course, this was just one piece, right? So one piece was the design of the approximation algorithm, thinking of this computationally, looking at the algorithm design. And it's a very interesting piece, but it's just one part of the equation. I think a very large part of the equation, which several of my co-panelists here would be able to speak more to, is what are the good ways to design this process as a whole, right? So who is even deciding what are the right constraints, what are the right categories, how do we even decide what is a representative sample? And the process that was used in this particular case study that I'm talking about, what we did was a two-stage process. So first, two process leading up to that in terms of different community events, a lot of discussion that happened in the public realm. But basically, when it came down to vote, first, a set of constraints were proposed. So should the committee be representative across gender? Should it be representative across race? Should it be representative across religion, etc.? So different places where one could enforce representation. So first, one voted on the criteria and what that would look like. And then about a month later was the actual election that ran just to vote on the candidates themselves. So that's how this particular election worked, although there would, of course, be many potentially different ways to design this process and to elicit those initial votes. In this particular case, there was, of course, a canton as a whole, but there were different like regions within each canton that were each having an election. So it was really kind of 8 elections that ran in parallel. And the biggest one was a committee of size 18 that was being elected from 50 candidates, and each voter could vote for 18 candidates. And the type of criteria that were elicited via this process that they agreed upon was one for gender, one for age, and one for locality. So there's a lot of political tension between people living in cities and people living in the countryside. So that was one of the places in which diverse representation was required in this election. And then once that was satisfied, we could use our type of technical fair multi-winner voting solution. So I just wanted to present this case study. I think there's, again, many different people on the panelists that can speak to different parts of this process as a whole. And I look forward to hearing your questions, and I'm happy to dive into any more of the details on the different aspects of this. On the technical side, I worked with Lingzhao Huang, Vijay Keswani, and Nishit Bishnoi. And then our partners in particular was a nonprofit called Appel Citoyen with Florian Evenkwa and Johan Rochelle. So I just wanted to say my thank you to them as well. It was really a fun and exciting project to be a part of, and I'm happy to share it with you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mark Gorton. I'd like to first thank Alan for inviting me to participate and everyone who's put this together. It's really an honor for me to be included in this group and be asked to talk. I'm going to speak about the problems with mass elections and present what I call the micro-democracy working group alternative. I have been quite involved in politics or civic engagement in New York City and New York State for quite a while. And I have seen the structural problems that exist, and it seems like good government groups are always fighting a system where the entrenched interests are working for themselves and not in what you would think of the interests of the general public. And after fighting time and again and through election cycle again, it just seemed like the structure of the system was so fundamentally flawed that I began to think that the problem comes down to the very nature of mass elections. And I'm sure a lot of people are very aware with lots of problems that we have with poor quality leaders and corruption in the system. And I've just seen time again the corrupting nature of elections as candidates are required to make promises, get money, build coalitions. And so frequently what you have is sort of good people who are forced to corrupt themselves just to get elected. And that creates all sorts of issues and all sorts of corruptions and problems we have in our government. And I'm sure I don't have to tell people here about lots of these. So I started thinking about how it would be possible to build an alternative system that both is representative and captures democratic intent, but also is resistant to corruption and attracts and selects good leaders. And after thinking about it, I have formulated some ideas, which I will share here. So it's basically based on a working group system. So rather than having mass elections where everybody in the population is expected to participate in a very, very thin and trivial way in lots and lots of elections, and most, as most people know in most elections, your vote really somehow doesn't matter very much. The concept of democratic participation would be shifted towards one that is much chunkier, of occasionally participating in a working group that would be taking a very specific decision. So rather than having a small say in lots of decisions, really this focused attention is partially designed to get a better outcome. So I imagine a three-step process. So the first step is an election, and it's actually a micro election, a very, very small election among a group of perhaps somewhere between 40 and 100 neighbors. So this election is meant to be not very daunting, easy to campaign for, among people that are hopefully well known to the candidates. And the reason that I have thought that having these micro elections would be good is because the fact is that most people are not very engaged in politics and civic events. And rather than, some people are just too busy, don't have time. So rather than trying to get people who are not particularly engaged to be engaged, that would have a chance to get people who could be representative of their own community and who would care to be engaged. And still having these very small elections would give you a fairly good representative sample of the population. So basically, at the end of this process of micro elections, about 1% of the population would be chosen as micro representatives, or people that would be available to serve on working groups later. So then the next step would be staffing working groups. And this would be done randomly. So really these working groups would work much more similarly to the way juries function right now, where people who are chosen at random to participate in a jury, this people who would be chosen from random of the pool of micro-representatives to participate in these working groups. And then the process that I imagine for choosing office holders would be decomposed. And the example that I'm presenting here is something that I think of as an election for a reasonable sized office. So maybe a member of the House of Representatives, or governor of a moderate sized state, or a mayor of a city. This process could be scaled. I mean, obviously a process that involves 100 people is too much to choose members of a local school board, and maybe too few to choose the president of the United States. But still, these processes can be scaled for the appropriate size. But the important thing are the steps that I have decomposed it to here. So the 3 steps are choosing the candidates to be considered, doing research on those candidates, and then finally choosing the final office holder. And a big part of the reason that I am suggesting breaking it up into different job functions is to reduce the risk of corruption. I think it's quite possible, again, particularly for large and high stakes elections, that having a small number of people, I mean, maybe as few as 100 who are, having a very strong say in the process of choosing the final office holder, those people are obviously could be easily targets of bribes and threats and things like that. Again, if you're talking about choosing the mayor of a small town, maybe these are not really issues. For much bigger offices, much more so. For if you're talking about choosing the president, you might want to choose the people and quickly sequester them away so they couldn't be corrupted. But really, what this, a big part of why I think this could be a superior solution is that you have people who have the time and a reason to focus, a reason to invest time and effort in really becoming educated about the people who are involved, putting in time to be thoughtful. One of the great challenges with mass elections is that you have so many people who have so little stake in the system that it's very hard for them to merit investing the time to be making an informed decision. So by having these much more engaged, informed, deliberative bodies, the hope is that the choice that will be made will be much more rational, and you have people who are much more engaged, and a lot of the techniques that we see now in terms of mass disinformation and these social media campaigns and all the different things that are distorting the democratic process now, this process that I'm proposing is somewhat immune, or at least resistant to that. Now, there are other corrupting vectors that could be used to attack this, but I do think that the fact that you bring random people together for a brief period of time and then disband these committees when they're done means that the target for any sort of corrupting attack is really ephemeral, and it can be that hopefully would make this whole system very resistant to corruption, or at least fairly resistant, which I think is really one of the main things that I've been shooting for in my design of this system. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. as opposed to everyone else involved here, I'm an amateur, I'm not involved in academia, but I really am interested in working on these ideas. So if anyone is interested in engaging, I'd be really happy to talk to people. Here is my information. And I hope to be able to make some connections. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I guess it's my turn. I'm Helen Landmore. I'm not going to use a PowerPoint because I suspect that the reason I don't need a PowerPoint is that my idea is much simpler than what's been presented so far. Instead of offering what I see as complicated epicycles to salvage the current system, I propose changing the system altogether. The main problem I see with what we call political representation today, as I diagnosed in my book Open Democracy, is that this type of representation and the regime form it corresponds to is fundamentally exclusionary. Electoral representation, as Aristotle, Montesquieu, Bernard Manin more recently have told us over and over again, is an aristocratic selection mechanism based on an inegalitarian principle of distinction. Why? Because elections only empower those who stand out socially in the eyes of most. This is why the Greeks of classical Athens did not use elections to staff political offices. Instead, they used a lottery-based system that distributed power equally among the individuals who qualified as citizens. Citizenship was defined in exclusionary ways, it's true, in ancient Greece, but distribution of political office among citizens was perfectly inclusive and egalitarian. We moderns, by contrast, reinvented democracy in a very elitist form, choosing elections as the primary mechanism to select representatives, meaning to select people who are going to stand for us and make decisions on our behalf. And even as the franchise has kept expanding since the 18th century and the restrictions on who can run for office have disappeared, access to power in electoral democracies remains limited to those who can win elections. Again, because they have attributes that are not widely distributed in the population, say charisma, height, intelligence, but also money and connections. Meanwhile, other people's power, perhaps 95%, 98% of the rest of the people, is limited to voting for such people every 4 years. So why is that a problem, you might ask? Well, not only does it mean that we do not live in authentic democracies, since for most of us, representative democracy means being ruled and almost never ruling, but electoral democracies tend to suffer from the blind spots one would typically expect from oligarchic regimes. They have a tendency to ignore, among others, the poor, the young, the minorities of color, and the losers of economic policies like free trade or austerity measures. This is so because these people rarely make it to positions of elected power, or any power at all for that matter. Yet, if these people are not in the room where laws and policies get deliberated on and made, not only do their interests fail to be taken into account, but even if they are taken into account, such interests are not as likely to be served properly for lack of a proper first-hand perspective applied to explaining and promoting them. In the US, these blind spots of electoral regimes have harmed the welfare of the African American community since the birth of American democracy, and more recently, the welfare of the working class since the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s. In France, similarly, a government consisting of largely urban, educated individuals who live in city centers and perhaps bike to work were shocked to discover that the well-intentioned fuel tax in November 2018 could generate the sometimes violent pushback of peri-urban, lower middle-class people, causing the rebellion now known as the Yellow Vests. This elitist bias of electoral democracy cannot be fixed. It is intrinsic to elections and may get worse with time or under conditions of growing economic inequalities. It can be mitigated, but it cannot be fixed. My solution consists in finally facing up to this reality, to this fact, and considering alternative modes of representation that are more inclusive and egalitarian, namely more democratic in the proper sense of the term. The innovation here is both conceptual and institutional. I propose to decouple the idea of democratic representation and the idea of electoral representation. These are not synonymous. Or in other words, I propose to render elections optional to the concept of democratic representation. Second, I develop a vision of democracy that I call open democracy, partly based on this new non-electoral concept of representation. And I argue that only in such a regime would we be truly political equals and able to avail ourselves of the entire collective intelligence of society. An open democracy is structured by 5 institutional principles: participatory rights, deliberation, the majoritarian principle, democratic representation, and transparency. But here is not the place to develop the full vision for open democracy. So let me simply focus on this idea of democratic representation as distinct from electoral representation, and on the core institution of an open democracy that this democratic representation translates into, namely the open mini-public. A central contender for a type of political representation that is inclusive and accessible to all equally is indeed what I call lotsocratic representation. That's representation based on random selection or selection by lot. Examples of lotsocratic bodies are the Council of 500 of classical Athens, as well as its large popular juries, and under modern circumstances, things like citizen juries, consensus conferences, deliberative schools, citizens' assemblies, and the like. All qualify as type of mini-publics because they aim to present a miniature portrait of the people. Although technically this is only true of very large ones. So what if instead of elected chambers, we used randomly selected ones to set the agenda for the polity or even make laws? The advantage of random selection is twofold. First, it creates a much more egalitarian distribution of power. If we institutionalize such bodies at all levels of the polity, and perhaps also in firms, hospitals, and schools, say, and with enough rotation, all of us would have an equal chance and a real chance of exercising real power over the course of our life, not just consenting to it at regular intervals. And if this is true, I think even if we need to implement stratified random sampling rather than pure sortition, because for smaller bodies, this is the only way to get the categories we care about represented somewhat fairly. It is in that sense a democratic improvement over elected parliaments, where most of us will never set foot. Second, random selection or stratified random sampling reproduces in small the cognitive diversity of the larger group, namely the different ways of thinking present in the population. This minimizes the risk of blind spots and increases our chances of making good decisions for the group. I thus propose as the heart of a considerably reformed democracy, the open mini-public, a body of a few hundred people forming a new kind of representative legislative body. This body is open, I specify, because in order to avoid closure and disconnection with the larger public, its deliberation must remain accessible and visible to the rest of the public, including interest groups, who can input those deliberations at any stage, for example, via the use of online crowdsourcing platforms. This allows the smaller body to tap the information of the larger public, but also promotes a larger public debate about the nature and content of the deliberation going on, which is important for the legitimacy of the mini-public to begin with. So it's highly unlikely at this stage that a legislative open mini-public of this kind is going to replace elected assemblies, though some have been calling for something like this. And I personally think that this is the more coherent ideal, ultimately. Again, at this stage, what we can realistically consider is augmenting electoral democracy and electoral assemblies with such lotsocratic bodies to make them more truly, to make the whole system more truly representative. Even if no replacement occurs, though again, some people have called, for example, for replacing the Canadian Senate with a lotsocratic body, or the House of Lords with a lotsocratic body, or the CSAP in France with a lotsocratic body, the change still implies a significant redistribution of power from elected chambers to the new open mini-publics. One could imagine having an open mini-public legislate specifically about environmental issues, issues around climate change, or issues about the future. And we could also envisage giving them the power to veto certain bills coming from the other chambers when they run again against its own mission. Or one could imagine ad hoc mini-publics being convened on certain issues at the initiative of either the government, parliament, or the citizens themselves via the right known as citizens' initiative. In the latter case, the recommendations of the one-off mini-public would have to be made at least somewhat binding on the other legislative institutions, because we know from experience that otherwise they largely get ignored. This proposal, even in its more reformist and complementary version, may seem far-fetched to you, but in fact, a lot of experimentations around similar ideas have been underway for over 20 years. A recent OECD report titled The Deliberative Wave thus documents around 287 deliberative experiments involving mini-publics of that kind around the world over the last 20 years. And just in the last decade, there's been a surge as well. Among the more salient examples, I'll just mention in 2017 in South Korea, the Citizens' Assembly of randomly selected citizens, which was given the final say over the decision whether or not to continue the construction of 2 nuclear reactors, a decision that was actually implemented over the country president's preferred choice. In 2017 as well, Mongolia passed a law requiring that a deliberative poll be held prior to constitutional amendments. In May 2018 in Ireland, a popular referendum validated the recommendations of a specially convened Citizens' Assembly of 99 randomly selected citizens to decriminalize abortion. And this was followed by a referendum in which this proposal was approved. Most recently in France, the Citizens' Convention for Climate, which I've studied and closely observed, made 149 recommendations about how to curb greenhouse gas emissions in a spirit of social justice. Half of those proposals have now been turned into regulations, and many of them are currently influencing various proposals, various bills. At the smaller scale, regions are now interested in using mini-publics to set the agenda of the legislative bodies, as has been the case for a year in the German-speaking region of Belgium, for example, where they had a council of 24 randomly selected citizens, so a very small jury-like body that could convene larger citizens' assemblies and set the agenda for the local parliament. Brussels, the city of Brussels now, is developing so-called deliberative committees to help guide public policy. At the global level, NGOs and academics are now organizing, it's coming up this fall, the first global climate assembly to accompany the negotiations around the Conference of the Parties 2021 in Glasgow. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of this being tried out in the United States as well. I believe this is the only way to aim for a more democratic kind of political representation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's terrific to be part of this. I'm Rob Richie. I often feel I'm talking about change in a way that's bolder than most people, but I feel in this set of presentations, maybe I'm being moderate by only being for proportional voting for US House elections and widespread use of ranked choice voting. I will say there's something important to me about the electoral process that doesn't displace some of these other bold ideas, but also means that the seeking consent of the governed, reaching out to people in a process where there's full debate is something that I certainly want to make sure stays part of any system that we have. I'll go ahead and share my screen and get into my PowerPoint here. So what I'm going to zero in on is those ideas of what we can do statutorily in the United States. And I want to get at it through the lens of why it is particularly important now. We are in time of sort of heightened deep political polarization. To us, it's really grounded in the use of winner-take-all voting. So election rules drive behavior. We don't think this is what we're seeing in Congress and in many of our elections is because of bad people who decide to run, but they have certain incentives that drive what happens. You can certainly see in very basic ways that the election rules drive behavior. In just use a couple examples, when you're having presidential nomination processes, Iowa goes first, and lo and behold, about 50% of events in the first run up to the year before the nomination contests take place in Iowa. The swing states in the general election for president are the ones that are tightly contested. Others are not. At about 98% of campaign events and ads are earmarked to voters in those 12 states. not because the candidates don't care about the rest of the voters, but it doesn't affect whether they win or lose. So winner take all means 51% of votes, which of course is a majority, wins 100% of representation, 49% wins 0. And if it gets a little bit more tilted, 55% or so, it's essentially a done deal. If you're comfortably ahead or hopelessly behind, you can't win. So there's a good book by Lee Drutman called The Doom Loop, and I'll sort of walk through how things are playing out, but we're in a cycle that's reinforcing itself and things are getting worse and worse. So first, most states and districts have a partisan tilt. That's natural, that the parties aren't sort of evenly placed. And as political polarization increases, that winner-take-all rule means that partisan majorities decide more outcomes. The general election doesn't really matter. So to win the election, most candidates don't really need to worry about the general election. They only need to worry about how they get nominated to be part of the majority party in that area. So they only need to cater to those relatively small percentage of voters that participate in partisan primaries. There was a recent study, it's about 10% of voters are really deciding the great majority of outcomes. And for some reason, okay, there we go. And then as a result, Congress is now more prone to gridlock. And you can see just how difficult it is for the parties to take on anything substantive and challenging and actually do things together. Their base doesn't want them to do it. They're fighting. They can get things done when one party runs everything, but even that can be challenging. But certainly when they're divided, it gets really challenging. These disputes lead to greater partisan ill will. The partisan voters therefore become more fearful and angry of the base. And so the cycle continues. And so things just keep getting worse and worse. So how can we sort of get out of this? We first have to start with the fact that we're in a very difficult place in a winner-take-all election system. More than 80% of congressional races are just fundamentally safe because of that winner-take-all dynamic. FairVote does a report we started way back about 25 years ago called Monopoly Politics. But our insight was that we could make projections in the great majority of House races knowing nothing about the current cycle, just based on whether the incumbent was a decent incumbent and which you could measure in kind of some simple ways, and the tilt of the districts. And we've been doing this for years. We could project the 2020 House races and about 85% of races within a week of the 2018 elections and essentially get all but one or two right. In some cycles, we get every single one right. So it means that whatever campaigning happens in those districts doesn't matter. If you look at the underlying nature of districts and note the pattern here, it isn't just happen when districts are drawn, it's happening between cycles of districting, just that districts are becoming less and less competitive. And you're seeing voters split their tickets less, and they are voting more consistently. So back when I helped start FairVote back in '92, at that time in Congress, about 112 seats had members who represented a district won by the other major party's presidential candidate. So more than a quarter of seats were held by someone who was of a different party than the candidate that won that carried that district in the presidential race. We're now down to that's only 16 people, less than 4%. So almost total alignment. The US Senate is the same way. State legislative races have become more and more lined up with presidential races. Just basically the partisan label drives behavior. At the same time, the country's going through this big sort concept, the idea that people are becoming more alike politically with others where they live. And you can measure that again, this isn't gerrymander, this is just sort of counties, and counties have become more and more aligned with one party or the other at the same time that people are splitting their tickets less and less. And you look at sort of the red-blue map, if you have our simplistic system that we have, where it's just Democrats and Republicans, and there's much more coherence and sort of solid blocks of color, which also plays out in predictability of races. So let me talk about the two ideas that we focus on. Both of these are statutory. Both of these are getting increasing attention. Ranked choice voting is getting a lot of use. So that is the idea of replacing when you vote for one person or you vote at all. Essentially, you go from a ballot where you can just vote for one person, a single choice ballot, sort of all or nothing. You either give a vote to someone or not, with a ranked choice ballot. And I'll explain what that means, but it's something different. And then we replace a winner-take-all rule with a proportional system, kind of like what we heard about was going on in Switzerland, and indeed is used in most countries in some form. So a ranked choice ballot, here's a very basic one. Instead of just ticking off one candidate, you get to say, hey, here's my candidate who's my first choice, but I actually do have something to say about other candidates. In this case, the person's saying Brown's our first choice, Castro's our second, Adams our third. This is simple and easy for voters to do. It was introduced, say, in 5 states, Democratic parties used it in presidential primaries last year, first time, vote by mail ballots. 99.9% of people cast a valid ballot, and the great majority of people ranked more than one. So here's what you do when you count them up. So you add up the first choices only. So you look at that ballot, you only count first choices. If someone wins more than half of the vote, you have a first round winner. That's it. If not, the candidate that is in last place is dropped out, and you're only counting that ballot's candidates for their next choice. So everyone has only one vote that counts, but you get a backup if your favorite is out. So in this case, it goes down to 3. You still don't have a majority winner. You knock out the last place candidate, and voila, you have someone over half the vote. So that's all there is to it. So what does this mean politically? So one is it creates the space to have more than 2 choices and not have this immediate finger pointing dynamic where, like, why is that person running? And, you know, right now you're having kind of a debate on the Republican side where some people love Donald Trump, some people don't. And there's sort of talk about whether there should be another party. And there's a lot of saying like, well, we can't do that because we'll split the vote. You know, Ralph Nader running as a Green Party, or Ross Perot as an independent, or what have you. That they don't talk about whether that person has an idea that's different or a political philosophy that should be represented. It's just the dynamics that you can't have more than 2 people in our politics. If you break that down, you begin to break down the binary. What it means kind of politically with outcomes is that candidates, and you really see this particularly well in city elections. We have lots of good data from cities and primaries, and it encourages candidates to engage with more voters, run more positive campaigns, not everyone being lovely to everyone else, but it incentivizes reaching out. And the winners typically get affirmative preferences from 65, 70% of the voters, which is an indication of that sort of reaching out. And again, it's being used quite a bit in the United States now. We're up to 2 states using it for president and Congress. 90 plus colleges and universities sort of do it on their own. 20 cities, we might see as many as 10 more cities using it in Utah this year. So then I'll turn to multi-member districts. Now we see a lot of multi-member districts in local elections in the United States. You still see a number of state legislatures with them. I actually have 3 House members here in Maryland. We heard some about them in Switzerland. Now there's a lot of ways you can use multi-member districts, but the basic idea is you change from having only one person trying to represent everyone in a geographic area. So Congress or the US House, not a single US House member represents any of the same people that anyone else does. And you go to having, say, in this example in Massachusetts, you go to having bigger districts with more representatives. So it's 3, 3, and 3 in this case. If you use the ranked choice system, single transferable vote in a classical terminology, it no longer takes 50% to win. It takes a little over a quarter of the vote to win 1 out of 3 seats, 50% to win 2, more than 75% to sweep all 3. That high percentage of what it takes to win all 3 has a really interesting impact. So what does it mean for polarization and representation? David Brooks wrote a great column in the New York Times a couple of years ago saying it's the one reform to save America. This is this Fair Representation Act, which has been introduced and is about to be introduced again. And what it means for polarization is that really there's no safe seats anymore, right? So all that kind of blocked out of the country, that stark red and blue. In fact, pretty much every single district is going to have both parties having the power to help elect someone from it. You can have Republicans in New York City and other cities, Democrats in rural areas, and different kinds of Democrats and different kinds of Republicans. Third parties and independents have a challenge to win, but they can hold the major parties accountable in a different kind of way. And then you have a Congress that has sort of a much more sort of centered political center represented, but also it has sort of vibrant representation of left and right. And of course, we're not linear that way, and it's sort of a more 3-dimensional reality that would allow it to function differently. So it was HR 4000 in the last Congress, sort of to sum up the representation impacts, our simulations show that if with this system in place, every single state that has at least 3 seats, you would have every voter probably end up being represented by candidates from both major parties. And again, those independents and third parties having a fighting chance. Women would see a dramatic increase in representation. There's a lot of good data that just showing going to multi-member districts would change that, but the more fluid nature of choice and competition would very likely lead to a significant boost just from the get-go from the system. And people of color would have a really dramatically different opportunities to both participate and win. One way of showing that is that you can go from California, a whole line of states, all the way to my state of Maryland, and every single one of those states, every person of color would have the opportunity to join with other like-minded voters to help elect a candidate of choice, which would be quite dramatic when you think that that's the South and that's part of the regions that have been so racially polarized. So look forward to chatting about it with people. I'm Rob Richie, and I'll pass it on to my next person.
Okay, thanks very much. So these have been great. One thing I wanted to remind people to is please use the raise hand button on the bottom of the Zoom screen to ask your question, or else the chat function. I'm going to collect those and then ask questions. But to get us started, I think there's one question I'd like to ask all the panelists, which is how much do you hope that these different electoral systems will make a difference in terms of overall outcomes? So if we look around the world, we see big differences, certainly across different electoral systems, but I'm struck by the fact that even within places that have the same electoral system, there's just enormous variation in terms of some of the negative things that people have said that they want to try and fix in democracy. So that tells us that electoral rules can make a difference, but not all the difference. And I wanted to get some sense from the panelists of how much of a difference they think that changing to these incredibly interesting systems will make to outcomes they care about. And then secondly, whether they think there's any cost to the particular mechanisms that they're talking about. Is there a trade-off, and how do they see the downside? So we can go in the order in which we started, and then while that's happening, I'll look at people's comments in the chat, and we'll get ready to call on people in the chat. And when I do call on you, we're going to ask you to go live and ask the question yourself on video, and so please be ready for that. Okay, Elisa, first to you.
Yes, thanks so much, Stephen, and thanks again to all the panelists and everyone for being here. Yeah, that's an incredibly interesting question, and I think it's very hard for me to say exactly how much change it can affect. I do think it's, of course, who is setting the rules and setting the tone for our country is incredibly important. And so I do think that changing how we elect people, changing if we elect people, all of these things can have incredible impact. Now, quantifying that in some way, I'm not quite sure how to do that. And while I do think there is a cost, I think that cost is just in terms of time and effort and more participation, which sounds like a cost, right? There's more work that has to be done, but that naturally is more work of involving more people, involving everyone into the whole process that is affecting their lives and is affecting our future. So it's a good cost to pay. If the cost is more people have to participate, then that's exactly what we want to do. Thank you.
Mark?
I mean, obviously the system is large and complicated, and no one change is enough in any way. A large part of what I have been thinking about has to do with just the incentives of elected officials, because most people tend to respond to their incentives, and if something helps them personally, they're inclined to move in that direction. And so I've been personally focused on trying to think about how to mitigate bad incentives in the system and create good incentives. but there's obviously so many pieces to how government is structured and runs. And I think that we're really at a point where, I mean, essentially the systems that we're running with today in the US are 100 or 200 or more years old. And there have been so many changes to society, to scale, to technology. I actually think there are, the possibility of openness and transparency due to new computer technology means that it's possible for people to have, much more insight into the details of how government works and to perhaps micro-target things. So I think there's a whole, I'm hoping that in the next generation, we'll see a range of new ideas and a whole range of changes to improve the efficiency and honesty of the system, because right now government doesn't, kind of clunks along, but it is by no means working well in most places.
Thanks. Hélène?
So I think any of these proposals are improvement on the status quo. I do feel, though, that it will create more visible diversity, but without much of or not enough of a cognitive difference, if you will, in the sense that at the end of the day, elections remain, as I insisted, elitist. So you will bring about more, people of color, women, the sort of like demographic categories we care about because they're easy to understand and grapple with. But there are other categories we underestimate, like certain types of minds that correspond to personalities that don't sell well in election. And so I worry that we're still going to end up with very biased, groups of people in power, and I think we are losing out on the power of a greater diversity that way. That would also be a lot more egalitarian. So that's my worry. And then I would say that this is perhaps a question to Mark. I worry about the transparency of this scheme, which is quite complicated. Do we not lose some democratic appeal when we have these multiple steps and there's some elections, some random selection? Don't people lose the chain of accountability in those schemes?
Yeah, Mark, please answer.
I actually think that this can be, that you can still have quite a bit of accountability, because right now, we elect all sorts of horrible elected officials, and I don't think you hardly ever see anyone who feels particularly bad because they cast a vote. No one really feels any ownership of any decision. So certainly the process that I've suggested, I intended to be, highly transparent, so people, we can see how the deliberations work, what the output is, but also then people, a small number of people would be very much responsible for particular leaders. So if that person did a bad job, you could go back and say, you group of people, you chose them, it's sort of your fault. Again, nothing is perfect, everything is imperfect, but I do think that that questioning, and again, Hélène, you're doing that with your own work, the idea that just somehow polling large numbers of people leads to a good decision, I think that we see the problems with that, and so trying to find an alternative, I think any of these solutions, you have to try in reality and then sort of see what works and iterate. I don't think anything is perfect in the abstract or in all contexts.
Thank you. Rob?
Well, I'll say one thing. I guess I would be loath at this point to not ground any system in a one person, one vote electoral system. So I am a big believer that that's important, and that's a way of sort of measuring consent of the governed, having this conversation. I think there's interesting ways to add in some ideas that would add dimensions but also let's start by making that dimension work, because we have so far to go in the United States that it's sort of easy to start there because it is so problematic and so in some ways transparently straightforward how to make it much, much better. Our slogan at FairVote is a more perfect union. And I think part of that choice was the belief that it's an ongoing process. We're not going to get perfection. So no, it's not like we get the ranked choice voting for all of our elections in the Fair Representation Act and we can just, say we're done, but it would be starkly and importantly better. And I think one area that we can think about also is sort of embracing the fact that we have a particularly federalized system in the United States. We have about 500,000 elected offices. We have a lot of local government, more than I think any other country, or at least most countries, and that there's an opportunity in there to try to see if there's ways that we could generate more citizen participation and dialogue that in a sense captures some of what people are talking about here. But the reality is right now, people are actually less interested in participating at that level, even though it's closer to home. So it's something that I think that we should work on. Last thing I'll say, big fan of things like participatory budgeting. There already are a lot of kind of creative things going on out there, and we just need to keep thinking about different models to add on to the electoral one.
Yeah, Hélène?
Yeah, I just want to reply to the point that, if we care about one person, one vote, we have to stay with elections. I don't think so. We can have one person, one vote used in the context of referenda and all kinds of mass popular voting. What I object to is not the one person, one vote principle, which of course is central and would be a part of an open democracy, but the use of that just to select people who then exercise power on our behalf. I think we should be using this one person, one vote right to make decisions ourselves based on the recommendations of a randomly selected body or directly. It's not a real choice.
One thing I think makes a big difference in the US is just the closed primaries in so many different states that influence who gets there. Even in places with the same electoral system, you see that having a huge difference. Anyway, let's open it up now to the audience. There is a huge wealth of knowledge and experience and cases that they know about in terms of the audience. So first we'll go to Katie Wells. Katie.
Hi, my name's Katie Wells. I'm a government teacher in Springfield, Massachusetts. I have a couple questions, but I'm going to start with one for Rob, just in case I only get the one. I think one of the fears in switching up the way that we vote is that safe states, whether they are red or blue, by taking steps to make their elections more fair, could give an advantage to like what's seen as the other side by taking the safety out of their elections. While states that don't adopt the measures retain those safe seats. So there's two parts to my question. Do you think there's a way to avoid this unintended consequence? And if the change was to be implemented nationwide, do you think there's a way to do it within the confines of the Constitution as it exists now, given that states make their own electoral rules, since it seems unlikely that we would see an amendment to increase voter fairness, given the lack of incentive for existing congresspersons to jeopardize their positions by removing the safety of their seats?
Well, that's a good question. And I'll say, I saw it as part of your chat question too about ranked choice voting having lost on the ballot in Massachusetts. The good news was that's the only time it's lost in the ballot in the last 5 years. And it's been on the ballot in more than 15 other jurisdictions, including cities. It's won by an average of more than 2 to 1 in every city voting on it for a while. So it doesn't mean you can throw it on the ballot everywhere and win, but there's a lot of sort of, I think, interest for change. And the more we use it, I think the better it can look. For Congress, you're right about the challenge of how do you have, one state be fair or not. And you see it play out when people talk about redistricting reform. And, if we have, kind of a better redistricting process, a fair one that might mean more competition and turnover of incumbents in our state and the other states don't, then, nationally, that's actually not fair, even if it's fair in the state. But a lot of states have moved ahead anyway on that. So that isn't a barrier to change happening state by state. There is a requirement for House elections that's statutory, that's important. It's a federal statute, most recently passed in 1967 after not having been in place for a while, which is to require single member districts. So this is the early Congresses had a lot of multi-member districts, at-large elections for Congress, and when a 1929 law that was sort of associated with also capping House size kind of ridiculously at 435 rather than having an ongoing conversation about increasing the House, it opened the door to multi-member districts, and some states were doing that in the 60s. So anyway, Congress said, well, let's have everyone be quote unquote fair by having single member districts. That isn't actually super fair, as we demonstrated, and you know, mostly non-competitive races, and a lot of gerrymandering going on in a bunch of states. And so the theoretical basis of the Fair Representation Act, which is statutory, doesn't require change in the Constitution, is to say, well, let's actually have states be truly fair and all simultaneously put in multi-member districts with a ranked choice system and have those benefits that I talked about. So the politics of that are big and bold, I think grounded in the logic that that's a good way to do it. But there's other approaches that may end up being the way it goes, which is sort of allowing states, again, to have the option to do it, and it goes more sort of state by state. But we're sort of launching the conversation, and we're doing it in a climate where we really need to do something. And that's, I think, the impetus for Congress. They're kind of stuck in a situation that a lot of them feel very challenged by. And I think that even if their own seats are safe, operating in Congress to get things done is not safe, or it's sort of hard for them to do what they actually want to do a lot of the times. And that creates, I think, the opportunity to actually get the big changes that are usually really hard to win.
Okay, Katie, you got one more because you had questions for a number of the other people. So pick one.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much for letting me ask another one. For Hélène, one of the criticisms of jury selection in some areas of the United States, including Connecticut, has highlighted the potential bias in selection based on the data that they're generating their lots from. Could you comment on that? And do you have any suggestions about how that could be avoided in your proposal?
So that's a fair criticism. I'll tell you what the French did, which it seemed to me like a decent solution. They had to select 150 citizens. So what they did is that they generated 300,000 randomly generated phone numbers. There's a private company that did that. And then they called the people and gathered their demographics and asked questions. And then they applied quota sampling to that. And then in the end, so the criteria were age, gender, education level, settlement, meaning whether they were urban or rural, geographic origin. We didn't have race because it's not a legal category in France. And one thing they failed to take into account, I think, which was, a mistake, is their opinion about climate change. I think that would have been important to sample as well. But at the end, they got 190 voluntary citizens to, not representative. I think it's too few anyway to represent statistically the people of France, but they're really diverse and tracking the main categories that we would care about. And that way they had 150 citizens at each session. That was as close. It seemed to be a decent method.
Okay, let's call on George Lindser, and I hope that Christine comes back in a moment.
Hi, thanks, Stephen. I am a publisher and editor of The American Leader, and my question is related to Stephen's opening question. And first, I just want to say, I think systems are, no matter what the system, it's in a way destined to be hacked. And we've seen that with the current system that we have. And I do agree with Rob that that making a more perfect union is the goal and an ongoing process. So with that in mind, my question is this: where do you see the role of civics education? And by that, I'm including mandatory service and a nationally standardized curriculum as a solution to the problems we face relative to systemic change. And anyone who has a thought on that, I'd be happy to hear it.
Okay, just put your hand up if you have thoughts on this. Hélène, did you?
Well, I tend to think that a lotsocratic system has a built-in civics education, which is not just listening to boring lectures, it's actually doing and practicing what we are constantly preached, you know? So it's Socratic practice of deliberation. And you can start in school. You could start at the university, you could start in your company. You know, there are all kinds of ways where we could reform governance so that people are randomly drawn into these decision-making bodies and learn about deliberating with other people, people who disagree with them, and that forges, also just bring into contact people who would never meet otherwise. You know, elected circles tend to be very homogeneous along a number of dimensions. When you have a random sample, you bring together a farmer from, you know, I don't know, Wisconsin, and a designer from New York, and you know, and a nurse from Minnesota. I don't know. These are people who've never really encountered people like themselves. So I think it's really important in forging a civic bond and bridging, and, you know, bringing the gap between a Trump voter and a Biden voter, for example, crucially.
Just add just a quick example of policy. It might be other Scandinavian countries, but definitely Norway. They sort of take this responsibility really seriously, that young people are soon going to be voters, are going to be participants, and there's a much more intensive civic education than is usual in the United States, but includes everyone going to the national capital for doing what often our elite students get to do here in the US, where there's sort of a mock Congress, and they get to see what Congress is like. And but they all get to do that, and they get to see the actual Congress, and you know, get to kind of a more hands-on feel for what they soon are going to be. And certainly I think we need to be investing and looking in those kinds of strategies.
Thank you. So I don't know if Christine's mic is back on, but I'll ask her a question. She said, I like Mark Gorton's idea and would support this implementation for elections such as president, but it would seem an unlikely scenario for smaller communities for offices such as mayor, etc., due to including a number of groups and the people within each group to do capable research. And if representatives are not held accountable now, what would need to be put in place for greater transparency and less corruption in order for a smooth transition? So this gets us back to this theme that we've got of maybe there are other things you need in addition to the rules. And I'm curious how you respond, Mark.
I mean, I certainly agree that the process that I outlined on my slide was very heavy. I do think the idea of a working group model to select, you know, the mayor of a small town still works, but maybe you're taking, you know, depending on the size of the town, you know, maybe it's one working group with 8 people who get together to choose, you know, someone that's probably known to them to be the mayor or something like that. I think you really can have a smaller scale process. And I really do think that there is value to the deliberative process. And so this, you know, that, you know, people talk and challenge each other, you will get a better output there. I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question? Now I'm already, it was.
Let me see.
Oh, it's about holding people accountable. So yes, what I proposed is, you know, just one piece of this, and I have ideas for a way to, you know, rethink, you know, large parts of our system now where we tend to put responsibility very heavily on elected leaders. But if you want to take, you know, something, for example, like the impeachment process. I mean, right now we have an impeachment process that is, you know, highly political and, you know, and you know, really biased, and, you know, you know, I don't think very many people are all that happy with it. But the idea that you would have some mechanism that under a certain threshold, whether it's a, you know, a certain set of working groups of people or a certain, you know, say, you know, we want to start an impeachment process, and again, call together working groups where you draw random people, and it could be a larger deliberative body. I mean, there are lots of ways to do it. But again, I think one of the core bases to my idea is that average people tend to be fairly honest And as long as they're not part of the system and compromised by political loyalties and things like that, they will not do a perfect job, but just doing a basically decent job is better than what we have in many ways now. And that also, bringing people together with a specific deliberative focus allows people to invest the time and energy to reach better conclusions than the kind of very superficial way that people form opinions based on mass media or whatever you have now. So I think there are lots of ways to include working groups, various different deliberative bodies to, whether it's choosing, what do we want the policy on immigration to be? We could, again, put together some sort of statistically valid deliberative body to then answer that question and give the administrators, say, implement the policy that's been chosen. So I think there are a lot of different ways to reconfigure things to both get democratic intent and to get smarter decision making.
Okay, great, thanks. Next up, we're calling on Matthew Myers.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate in Professor Landmore's class, and I have a question for Professor Celis. So I think it's really interesting to compare sort of your version of multi-winner elections to Mr. Richie's version. And I was wondering if, when designing the version in Switzerland, you considered a single transferable vote, because it would sort of have those, like you had quotas, but that would sort of do it built in and incorporate other elements like ideology that aren't so easily categorizable.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. That's very true. So these other types of systems like single transferable vote end up with much more representative committees. I was thinking of it in terms of committees, but panels or groups of people. It does it via a very different mechanism. And I think both approaches have different strengths and weaknesses, and which one you might want to use in a given context would matter. I think you absolutely identified the benefit of a single transferable vote method in that you don't need these specific or rigid.
Yeah, it's frozen. So we'll hope that Elisa comes back in a second.
I might just add a comment on that, just because I'll be intrigued to get more of the specifics of what happened in Switzerland. But there are ways to combine single transferable vote with some kind of guaranteed outcomes by gender or other categories. And it's an intriguing opportunity that actually single transferable vote permits within a proportional system. So anyway, I'll be interested in hearing more about the way that it was done there in Switzerland.
Yeah, Elisa, you froze briefly, so let's go again.
Yeah, so sorry about that. My internet cut out and I have no idea what you heard or what you didn't hear. So I'll try to not, hopefully this isn't all repetition for you. What I was saying is that it's, both systems are approaching the same problem, right? How do we get a representative electoral body through very different mechanisms? And what I was saying is that which one you might want in a particular context would vary. So I don't think one is strictly better than the other. The difference is kind of the mechanism that is used and the end result. So in a single transferable vote, what I was saying is Matthew very clearly identified that one of the huge benefits is that it kind of implicitly gets this diversification and doesn't need these rigid separate categories as to how many women or how many people from such and such category. And I think that is a huge value because it does allow you to get all these other more implicit categories. I would say the downside is that while overall you get more diverse committees or more representation, it's not guaranteed. And if you have groups of people that are very underrepresented in the overall population, but still deserve rightly a voice, it generally is not enough to get enough votes on those candidates, right? Or it might not be enough depending on the particular context. So by actually setting up these kind of strict these strict rules, you lose something in that brittleness, but you also gain something by first having a guarantee that you're actually going to get that desired representation and making sure that all parts of your population are represented.
Thank you. Shyam Sunder. Is Shyam there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The behavior of elected representatives has long been debated, what they actually choose to do, whether they they actually behave in a way that represents their constituent interests or the assessment of the general will or general good for society or something else, an interest of their own. My question is, how do you think your respective proposals might affect their behaviors of elected representatives?
Okay, we'll call on people in the order in which they present. If they would like to speak, and if they don't, they don't have to. So, Elisa.
Yes, so I think there's an explicit way in which it changes, in that if you have a more diverse or representative body, you just by nature have to tackle problems differently, because you can't conveniently ignore a huge part of the population you're supposed to be representing. But I think the other effect that we saw when doing this in Switzerland was that it was by far the most diverse set of candidates that we had seen in several years. So I think part of what implicitly happens when you set up alternative systems of governance is that people who might otherwise be disillusioned, might otherwise say, okay, there's no way I have any chance of winning this election, they participate as well. So that's one way in which kind of both explicitly and implicitly the conversation shifts, and you end up getting people with different interests, perhaps, or different motivations to be there and to be part of the process, and than you would otherwise have.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and this the problem of politicians being motivated by their own interests has really been, was kind of a very important in my thinking as I tried to design my system. I mean, because at least right now, and again, my experiences are very much New York based, but I think that they're, what we see here is common elsewhere. But the dominant political forces in New York are unions, real estate interests, the government contractors. And if you look at how the system works, it's basically to benefit those interests, because those interests are able to pay directly or indirectly or through blocks of votes or things like that, the various politicians, and the politicians are acting in their interests and not the interests of the public. And I think you see that all over. So I very much tried to create a system where you don't have these outside interests having very much direct sway over the government officials. The flip side of that is that there is less accountability. And so that is why I do think it is important, if we were to adopt my system, to have these sort of parallel systems, which I talked about, with sort of separate working groups to provide some sort of accountability there. But at least for me, this idea of interest of the politicians is really core to everything, because at least for me, it doesn't necessarily matter, what a particular government official looks like or which group they represent, if they're really just representing themselves and whatever interest is capable of buying them off. And so I think this idea of minimizing corruption is a completely parallel set of issues, in addition to increasing diversity and representation.
Thank you. Hélène?
Yes, I think it's a really good question and hard to answer, but my suspicion is that it will realign their behavior with the common interests and the public interest, at least to a degree, because what I observed, even in the context of the French Citizens Convention for Climate, which was, purely advisory, is that they had, the parliamentarians had to, and the government had to kind of like take into account this input and had to justify themselves publicly as to why they ignored certain proposals. And that creates a form of deliberative accountability. That is then, these arguments are mediatized and journalists can press questions. I mean, it becomes harder for the elected parliamentarians to stay stuck in partisan logics and ignore what the larger public, represented by this mini public, arguably wants. So I think it's for the better.
Rob?
So I think the questioner gets at sort of what the organizing principle in my presentation was, that we have to change incentives. And I think these two proposals do. Give a couple little examples for each one. So the ranked choice ballot, by just giving people backup preferences, just means that you now as a candidate have this different incentive to talk to more people. You particularly see this again in nonpartisan or primary elections. You will see, regularly the winners say, gosh, or losers too, this was really interesting. I mean, I just threw out the playbook that you just talk to your base and swing voters and talk to everybody and just look for a connection, right? Which is what you want, I think. And that just comes from the voter knows that they now have a second or third choice that could matter. And so they need to think more about candidates, and the candidate knows that. And then ultimately as a representative just has learned a lot more about the people that they're going to represent. Not the be all and end all, but a clearly just sort of step forward. The multi-member district, particularly, with a proportional system, and these are these candidate-based American style kind of forms of proportional voting. We've had some examples of them, but when the two really kind of clearest differences are that every representative will share constituents with someone from a different party. So you have a different reason when you're sort of serving your constituency to talk with people of another party, because you actually share representative, you share constituents, and when the parties retreat to their caucuses, they kind of bring the whole country, the whole state into the room, and the interests of cities are part of Republican caucuses and of rural areas are part of Democratic caucuses. And so the attentiveness of both caucuses, major parties at least, to be thinking about the whole country changes. And of course, the ranked choice feature kind of creates different opportunities to be rewarded for sort of solving problems for at least some representatives. That's what they will be in office for, and they can get reelected to do that.
Thanks. So thanks to all the panelists for offering fresh ideas and insights on a perennial question. How do we get better representation and hopefully better outcomes? A reminder just to visit the ISPS website, isps.yale.edu. Keep up with events. You can also join our mailing lists to receive a monthly newsletter and event information on future events, or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And lastly, just a big thank you to the organizers, Pam Green, Pam LaMonica, Tori Bilski, and Lamora Peer, as well as, of course, to all the people in the audience who asked such great questions and participated so much. So thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next event.